and welcome to our webinar, Building a Sustainable Future, Transitioning Towards a Circular and Low Carbon Construction Sector. My name is Carole Bachmann. I'm a manager of the European Rental Association, ERA, and I will be your moderator this morning. The webinar is organized by the European Rental Association, the voice of the equipment rental industry in Europe, and under the umbrella of the EU Industry Week. Before we start our discussions, I would like to remind you a few housekeeping rules. If you want to tweet during the event, please use the hashtag you can see on the screen. We would like this session to be as interactive as possible. So when you have some questions for the speakers, please post them in the Q&A section of the webinar, not in the chat. And the moderators will do their best to ask the questions to the speakers. Please use the chat if you have any technical issue, and our team will help you. When you leave the meeting, you will find a feedback survey, so it would be very helpful if you could fill it in. It could help us improving the quality of our meetings. And this webinar will be recorded. The building and construction sector accounts for approximately 40% of energy consumption and 36% of CO2 emissions in the European Union. It must decarbonize to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and ensure climate neutrality by 2050. Our aim today is to discuss how the construction sector at large, so including the equipment manufacturers, the contractors, and the rental companies, can become less carbon intensive and more circular, and how the policy and regulatory framework can contribute to that. For that, we will have two panels. The first one will focus on policy, and the second one on construction industry. And between both, we will take this opportunity to show you a very concrete tool that the construction equipment industry can use to see how they can optimize their carbon footprint. So let's start now with our first panel, the policy panel. And I will ask the three panelists to turn their cameras on. Thank you. So let me introduce my guest. From the European Parliament, we have Mrs. Iskra Mihaylova. She is MEP from the Renew Europe group. She's actively involved in the field of energy efficiency, renewable energy sources, and energy transition towards energy decarbonization and green solutions, as well as on synergies between European policies. From the European Commission, we have Mr. Philippe Moseley from DG GROW. Philippe works in the construction unit, and he's responsible for policies regarding the competitiveness of the construction industry with a focus on energy and resource efficiency aspects. And then we have Audrey Nugent, Head of Advocacy at the World Green Building Council. She's advising on sustainable buildings policies for the European regional network of over 23 national green building councils. So welcome to you three, and thank you so much for being here today. And I remind again to the participants that they can react and ask questions using the Q&A section of the webinar. So my first question goes to all of you. Do you think that the construction is a priority sector for promoting circular principles and reducing emissions? I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Mrs. Mihaylova?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this very interesting webinar. And I hope we'll have a very fruitful and interesting discussion. Of course, when we know that the construction sector creates 18 million direct jobs within the European Union and contributed about 90% of European Union's GDP, we have to pay attention and answer the question, thus construction sector is a priority sector to promote circular principles and reducing emissions in the moment when the whole policy of the European Union is oriented to reduction of emissions and Green Deal targets, and the whole transition toward digital economy and green economy. My answer will be yes, absolutely. The construction sector is the priority sector. It is not for occasion that this construction sector is part of the documents produced by the European Commission. And also the construction sector was in the center of the interest of the European Parliament when we worked on the problem of energy efficiency of the buildings. We prepared a special report maximizing energy efficiency in the building sector in Europe, in the building stock in Europe. So we focused at working at this report, we focused on the construction sector because of the few reasons which I will mention briefly. First of all, construction sector is responsible for the technology in the process of construction. Secondly, the construction sector is very much linked to the construction materials and all the chain which produces these materials and implement them in the buildings of Europe. Thirdly, the construction sector is actually responsible for maintaining the building stock around European Union. And it is very important how the whole services which the building sector provides to the citizens will be maintained in the context of the Green Deal and digital transition. So definitely, yes, the construction sector is a priority.
Thank you. Philippe, do you want maybe to answer that question?
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. Definitely the construction sector is responsible for a large proportion of the waste that Europe produces, over a third. I think the latest Eurostat figures we have is 36% of EU waste is coming from construction demolition. And construction also accounts for half of the resources that we extract in Europe. And so, I mean, those figures alone tell you the importance of addressing circular principles in construction. And then when it comes to emissions, you know, there are some well-known figures on the emissions coming from the use of buildings. And 40% of energy consumption is coming from the use of buildings. But when you include the embodied emissions from construction activity and the whole life cycle, it's bigger than that. It's roughly half. So, and we know that material efficiency could save quite a large proportion of those embodied emissions. So addressing those is definitely important.
Thank you. Audrey?
Yeah, I think to build on from the point that I've already, I think we're aware now of the impact, like Philippe has just said, of the sector on emissions and waste generation, and we've also got issues as well with demolition. But I think, you know, we need to go a little bit further now, and we have some policies in the EU policy framework under the EU Green Deal, the Circular Economy Action Plan, and we're looking forward hopefully for the strategy for a sustainable built environment, so that we can actually take action, I think, as a network of stakeholders across the value chain to, you know, prioritize and actually take action on the ground to drive sustainability and circularity in our sector. And I think it's really encouraging that we're seeing those signals in the EU policy framework. But I think it's up to us as a sector now to look at, you know, how do we implement and find those solutions together.
Thank you, Audrey. We touched already a bit that point in the first question, but Philippe, maybe could you tell us a bit more what the European Commission is doing to help the construction sector become more sustainable?
Well, we have a big element of the von der Leyen Commission is the European Green Deal, and one of the main building blocks of the Green Deal is the Circular Economy Action Plan that was unveiled about a year ago now, and that action plan proposed initiatives right along the life cycle of products, including initiatives for new legislation or revisions of legislation, and also non-legislative measures. And construction is one of the focus areas where, as we've heard, the current use of resources is high, but there's also the biggest potential for circularity. So we have, for example, the revision of material recovery targets in EU legislation for construction demolition waste. We are revising at the moment the construction products regulation, looking to introduce possibly some sustainability performance into that. And that would also generate some data through product declarations for construction products, and having good data is really important. And then also we have published guidance on circular economy principles for buildings design, which is a document that's on our website, and it is aimed at various target groups with guidance for how to introduce circular economy into construction projects. And then one of the sort of overarching frameworks that we should probably mention and use more is the levels framework, which is a framework for reporting and assessing sustainability against various indicators, including circularity, but also pollution, water, waste, all kinds of indicators in there. And the levels framework is went through a pilot phase. It's now being used, it's published, it's online. It's a really good way to measure and report on sustainability indicators, and we definitely encourage the whole industry to be taking up measures via the levels framework and really putting it into practice.
Thank you. Mrs. Mihaylova, what is the position of the Parliament on what the European Commission is doing?
We expect part of the proposals, legislative proposals from the European Commission. Some of them are now on the level of public discussion. Some of them we know that are almost prepared, and we expect to receive them in the European Parliament and to work on them to be sure that the co-legislator in the face of the Parliament will be on the track of the time, because it is very important to have all these legislation ready to support the construction sector. But I should add something which is, I think, very important. The other initiatives of the European Commission, which are very well supported by the European Parliament, and on the first line in this will be the renovation wave, a very important initiative which is extremely useful for the construction sector, especially after the crisis with the pandemic of COVID-19. And renovation wave will give opportunity to construction sector, first of all, to recover after the crisis, and secondly, to implement all the principles of the circular economy and all the principles of energy efficiency for the building stock in Europe. And of course, I would like to mention just partially, I'm not going to open this discussion, but I would like to mention the Bauhaus initiative, which is on the first view, it's related to the culture, education, and environment. But looking deeply, we see that the responsibility of the construction sector in this initiative is extremely important, because it will bring the Green Deal principles and circular economy principles to the life of every one of the citizens in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Audrey, you represent the World Green Building Council. Can you please tell us a bit what this organization is about and what the campaign At Building Life deals with?
Yeah, so World Green Building Council is a network of 70 green building councils who operate around the globe. So we're essentially an umbrella organization. And what our green building councils do at the national level is they bring together actors across the value chain to drive sustainability in our sector. So hopefully many of you guys on the call will be familiar with the work of our green building councils, but in each country their approach might be different. So some focus on certification tools. So for example, the DGNB tool in Germany, others are more focused on, advocacy, education and awareness raising. But what each of them does is they bring together the value chain in their country to drive sustainability in their sector. And increasingly, especially in Europe, our attention is turning towards looking at, buildings more holistically and across their whole life cycle. And that's what the Building Life project is about. So this is a European regional project of World Green Building Council. And what we're doing is bringing together a coalition of green building councils in Europe to recognize the potential that our sector, the built environment sector, has in delivering on the goals of the EU Green and the Paris Agreement. And what we're calling for in the project is for regional, so that means EU and national policymakers to start supporting more ambitious policies to tackle the total environmental impact, so carbon and resource related of the built environment. So what we would like to see as a first step is that policymakers move beyond just considering the operational emissions from a building, but start to consider both operational and embodied, the so-called whole life carbon in an integrated manner. And in order to achieve these goals, we're undertaking a series of activities across a number of different areas. So we've got a communications campaign, which is calling for greater action, and that's bringing together industry and policymakers. And we're also, actually figuring out how to make this a reality. So we're bringing together a group of leaders representing organization in Brussels and beyond to help steer the development of an EU policy roadmap on whole life carbon, and having that developed in a consensus way with that diverse sector of stakeholders, so that we're really representing the views of the people who work in our sector. So I think, we're also looking at, what are the policy recommendations we can make to move towards whole life carbon, but also how do we actually implement these policies? Because if you're going to make recommendations that the European Commission should start considering whole life carbon, you need to make sure that at the national level, at the European level, there's an infrastructure in place to support that policy ambition. So how do you create the databases needed to support that? How do you build the capacity of the sector to implement these new requirements? What is the role of existing directives like the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, for example? It's to understand all of these different elements and bring them together and come up with something that is, useful for the sector, but also has an impact in terms of the emissions that our sector has, and that we're delivering on the goals of the EU Green Deal. So it's a really, really ambitious project. But we're hopeful that the way in which we're going about it will bring together the value chain. We can build that consensus, and we can come up with something that works for our sector. And we would invite anyone on this call who's listening, who is interested in this, to either get in touch with myself or your local Green Building Council, because those roadmaps that I talk about at the EU level, that process is going to be replicated across 10 countries in Europe as well. So looking at it at the member state level also.
Thank you. So yeah, you expect a lot from the EU policies, of course, to help you on that.
Hopefully, but there's still a long way to go.
Good. I'm just checking if we have. I think we had one question in the Q&A, but I think we answered it already. So let's wait for the next ones. I have a question, maybe more for Mrs. Mihaylova and for Philippe. Of course, many European countries are, not to say all the European countries, are still very much preoccupied with the COVID-19 pandemic. according to you, how can a circular, low carbon construction sector contribute to Europe's green recovery?
Yes, this is the question of the moment. You are absolutely right. And I should say that most of the member states now work on their national plans for recovery and resilience. And it is very important to see the place, the role, and the opportunities given by these plans to the construction sector. Because in the middle of recovery is reconstruction of part of infrastructure, investments in the renovation wave, investments in green technologies, and investments in digital transitions. This is what we expect from the national plans, and I hope that the construction organizations of construction sector in the member states will be proactive during preparation of the national plans for recovery and resilience, and will advocate the position of the construction sector, because it is extremely important, as Audrey already mentioned, not only on the level of the construction itself, but also in the level of the whole life cycle of the buildings and constructions and infrastructure, because it will bring real results concerning the Green Deal targets and circular economy and digital transition, but also will bring this the opportunity what we expect for the construction sector recovery. So we expect that already in 2021 and in 2022 we will have higher rates of the construction's activities in the member states, and these national plans are the key answers for the member states, and we expect this national approach because the direction is already given by the European Commission and supported by the Parliament.
Thank you. Philippe, do you want to answer this question too?
Yes, I fully agree. The national recovery and resilience plans, which are using this special money in the EU budget to recover from COVID, are they're going to be coming our way for the Commission to comment on them, and we've already been seeing some drafts from the member states, and it's good to see a big element in there of building renovation foreseen in many of these plans, and so what we've been doing is giving feedback and encouraging them to integrate circularity questions when it comes to building renovation. For example, by deploying or setting up urban recycling platforms and facilitating reuse of construction materials and products. And this is all very much in line with the renovation wave strategy. So, looking forward over the next decade or so, I mean, that strategy is looking to create several 100,000 new jobs, enormous investment needed for renovation. There's a target to renovate about 35 million building units over the decade to 2030. More than doubling the annual rate of building renovation. So this is going to create a lot of construction activity. This is a big driver for employment, which is obviously good in the context of recovering from COVID, but we need to do this in a resource efficient manner so that we don't simply add, with all this new activity, add to a waste problem and a resulting greenhouse gas problem. We need to do it in a better way, and that's why a lot of these circularity principles and the digitalization of the industry as well are ways to do that, to work more efficiently with fewer resources in a better way.
Thank you. We may have more questions about COVID, either from me or from the audience later, but there is another topic that I would like to address with you too. It's the green public procurement. What are the opportunities for the construction sector in engaging in green public procurement contracts? And what are some other ways by which construction companies could be motivated in increasingly using circular solutions and acting accordingly to the principles of the circular economy? Philippe, do you want to answer that maybe?
Yeah, I mean, green public procurement is an excellent way for action to be taken really at the city level or local level. So it's not always, national or EU level where action can be taken, because public procurement can require, for example, certain metrics to be reported at a local level, or put conditions on building permits, and these are all things that local authorities are in control of, and so they can really support greater use of circularity in their area, and drive a sort of a green transition in that way. So that procurement is really a very powerful tool, I think, to integrate these questions, and so for the industry to engage with those as well is really important.
Thank you. Mrs. Mihaylova, do you want to say something on that?
I'm fully agree with Philippe. This is a very powerful instrument to continue with the Green Deal goals and circular economy on the place of each one of the infrastructural projects around the European Union. And I will support him in his vision that it is a moment when the only construction sector cannot manage itself. We need the partnership with the local authorities and regional authorities, which will create the circumstances and which will create the requirements for the green public procurement. And it is very important to create this partnership between local authorities, regional authorities, and construction sector. And also another point which is really very important, and I don't think we will have enough time to discuss it today, but to mention it. This is about qualification, education, and training of the labor in the construction sector, because requirements for the green public procurement are requirements for the construction sector, and the level of qualification, the level of knowledge of the labor in the construction sector is extremely important. And this is message for all the representatives of the construction sector, because we do understand, we try to put on place all the programs which can help the construction sector to improve and raise the quality of qualification. But this is a question of initiative of each one of the companies, and to be active, to be on place with the green public procurement and be responsible. It's mean to create the whole construction in the architecture of the organization of the company. So just to mention education, qualification of the labor force. Thank you.
Thank you. Audrey, is there something you want to say?
Yeah, I think, there's some really good points have already been made, but I think just to build on, when we're talking about, how to start thinking about embedding sustainability into the policy framework, procurement is often the first step that people look towards. And I was speaking to a cities network the other day who were looking at integrating, embodied carbon into their policies, and procurement, was a tool that they use. And I think that point has been made. And I think just that point on, education and awareness, that's really important as well, because if you're starting to, for example, some of our GBCs are looking at how to align some of the leveled indicators with procurement criteria and working with local authorities and building the capacity to do that. You need to understand, in this case, what levels is and how do you align that with procurement. And that's super important, because that goes back to the point of, you know, creating that infrastructure to implement these policies. You need the education, you need the awareness, you need the skills, you need the data, and procurement is a way to help you start building those things, you know, from the bottom up. At one point, I think was interesting, one of our GBCs mentioned it to me recently. He said it shouldn't be green public procurement, it should, procurement by its nature should just be more sustainable. So actually, should the language be shifted there? That's for another webinar, maybe.
I'm afraid. Thank you. We have some questions from the audience. So because time is running out, I want to read the first one, and it's maybe more for Philippe. Is there a framework to calculate the impact of construction machinery in terms of the circular economy? What measure can be implemented to include construction machinery in the circular economy rethink, particularly when machinery reaches the end of its life?
That's a good question, isn't it? So construction machinery, I mean, I think the, well, I mentioned already the levels framework, which is the overall sustainability framework for construction and buildings, which has various indicators. We're actually still working on levels, although it's published and it's up and running and usable. There are still some additional indicators that may be added in future, and we're also working on a web tool to be able to use it more efficiently, and some more guidance which will appear on the Levels website. So that would be the logical place to have it. I don't know now whether there is specifically something at the moment in there for construction machinery, but certainly it's an area in general that needs addressing. I know that there are moves in some member states already to look at zero emission construction sites, and so this is definitely something that is moving in some member states, and I mean, we don't have yet an EU level policy on this, but we're keeping an eye on it.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have 3-5 minutes before we have to finish our panel, but I've received also another question, which is probably for all of you. How do you see the role that rental, so construction equipment rental, can play in transitioning towards a circular and low carbon construction sector? I don't know, Philippe, do you want to go on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've heard, we're hearing more and more about products as a service, and you know, there are some examples of equipment like lifts being offered as a service rather than a purchase in buildings, which is an interesting development. And rental as a kind of business model in itself can be more sustainable sometimes, because it can increase the amount of time, or the amount of time that the equipment is used. So the more it's being used in service, the better. And so this is the kind of system that can work quite well to use our resources more efficiently in that way. So yeah, there's definitely a place for it. I mean, we don't have you know, an EU level position on rental as such for construction equipment, but it's certainly an interesting idea to keep an eye on.
Thank you. Mrs. Mihaylova, do you want to give us your opinion on that?
Of course, I will continue. Actually, to just a remark, I'm very glad that today we demonstrate a good coordination between the Parliament and the Commission. In many cases, we react strongly in the Parliament and we ask all the time something, but in this particular case concerning the construction sector, it seems like we are satisfied and we are working in the same direction. Of course, we expect the proposals for the directives, but anyway, it is visible today. I will continue in this way. This is not a subject to be regulated, I think. This is a subject of the free decision of the business, and it will be mostly discussed probably in the second panel. But what I can say is that from our political point of view, it is important to give as much as possible freedom to the construction companies and building organizations for maintenance of buildings, to be open for any decision which will bring to achievement of circular economy goals and Green Deal goals. And rental of construction equipment is one of these options which should be used. But again, I repeat, this is not a question of regulation. This is question of understanding and new culture.
Thank you. Audrey, do you want to react on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, renting is inherently a more sustainable model than more traditional ways. So I think, you know, in that regard, you're already kind of addressing some of those issues. And I think as well, I know you're going to present the calculator in a moment, but having that transparency on the impact, you know, enables people to make decisions with the correct data. And I think that's also really important as well. So.
Thank you. I see that more questions are arriving, but unfortunately, if we want to stay on time, I need to put an end yet to our panel. Of course, we will have a look at the questions. So thank you for going on asking them on the Q&A section. I want to thank Mrs. Mihaylova, Mr. Moseley, Audrey, Nugent for their participation to this first panel. And well, I hope you will be able to stay with us for the second part of our event. What will happen now? So we will show you a video about the E-Ray equipment CO2 calculator. This is a new tool created by E-Ray to raise awareness of all equipment stakeholders on the CO2 emissions of the construction equipment. And we hope that this tool, but also many other actions taken by E-Ray can contribute to make the construction sector more sustainable. Just after this video, Michel Petitjean, E-Ray's General Secretary, will show you how to use the CO2 calculator, comparing different scenarios of utilization. And just after that, Pollok, Managing Director of International Rental News, will welcome the speakers of the second panel. And I will meet you again at the end of the event. So now it's time for the video. Thank you.
Any industry today needs to know its carbon footprint in order to reduce its environmental impact. Together with life cycle assessment experts, ERA has developed the new Equipment CO2 Calculator, an independent, neutral and free-to-use tool to calculate the lifetime carbon footprint of construction equipment per hour of use. Simply insert information about the type of equipment, its production, transportation, lifetime utilization, energy consumption, maintenance, end of life and recycling, and get a detailed breakdown of the carbon footprint according to each parameter. You can then share results or compare different scenarios to explore how you could lower your greenhouse gas emissions. And you can also embed the calculator on your own website. Use the ERA Equipment CO2 Calculator and start to build a more sustainable future.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you receive me. So, good morning, everybody. So, we thought that we would take advantage of this little break between the two panels to make a very quick demonstration of the calculator. So, I prepared on this screen a case scenario for a typical equipment of the construction equipment industry, which is a mini excavator, let's say 2.5 tons. So I prepared a scenario, a basic scenario, filling out the 6 steps of inputs, as you could see, the transport equipment definition, production. In this case, we have the exact LCA from the manufacturer, so we put it on the equivalent CO2. We have the transportation, and we'll go back to that. We have the energy, the maintenance, and so on, and life. So this is a case where this mini excavator would produce about 13.8 kilos equivalent CO2 per hour of use. So there would be so much to say about this, but just to play with some inputs, with some parameters, if I open the version to compare, and we will work on some parameters. First, let's say transportation. So if we go to transportation, we have 4 inputs of transportation. In the basic scenario, we did use a small truck with an average load factor. So if we use a larger truck, let's say 28 tons, with a pretty good load factor, because we have transported many equipment on that truck this morning, so 70% or even 80%. And instead of 30 kilometers, because the equipment depot was closer, we could put 20, but it could be 15 or even 10. So in just that case, we see the impact. Transportation has become from 5 kilos to 1 kilo. And this is very important because transportation and energy, as you will see, are the 2 main factors in this case. Now, if I go to end of life, we didn't consider any recycling. If I put some recycling, let's say 80% recycling, we can see that we build up instantly some positive carbon footprint. And in this case, we go from 13.8 to 9 kilos. But maybe one interesting point is energy. So I will go back to my previous scenario just to show the real impact of energy. And we will see that. And I will take zero recycling. And on energy, if, for example, we go from fuel to electricity. So we see that electricity varies enormously from country to country. Here is United Kingdom. If we go right to the show, instead of emitting 7.5 kilos with fuel, by the way, it was a fuel with 5% biofuel, but we have to work much harder on this calculator to refine the type of fuels, because there are so many. We have to distinguish on the categories of engine. If we have engines on tier 5, tier 4, we have to account for the source of energy for hybrid machines. We have to distinguish on different biofuels and HVO and other alternative fuels. So this is just a rough scheme. So let's see, this is UK. Let's go, for example, to an extreme case, if you want to, which is, let's put Poland, for example, where most of the electricity is produced with carbon. So we'll see that in Poland, energy in that case is much worse than fuel, because we jumped up to 10.1 kilos. This is Poland. Of course, if we go to France, where we know that energy is very effective from a carbon footprint standpoint, let's go to France, and we'll see that because 78% of electricity in France is produced with nuclear energy, and 12% with renewable energy. So in France, the energy just is 0.6 kilo. But by the way, in that case, from when we go from fuel to electricity, we see that the production, which we call LCA, is jumping from 1.1 to 2.9, just because of the production, the materials entering into the batteries, and so on and so on. So there is an impact on production. And if we, last example, if we go to Germany, which is a very huge market, Germany is like UK in the average share of electricity emissions, 5.7 kilo. So time is running, so I don't have the time to go much further. What I would like to say is we will work at many refinements. Maybe at the panel later we will develop some of them. But again, this is a calculator, neutral, independent, universal, deemed to serve to all stakeholders, being contractors, being OEMs, or being service providers. So I will finish there. The time is running, and we are really looking for feedbacks and for questions in trying to improve this calculator. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, thank you, Michel. I hope I'm showing on the screen okay. So I'm going to be running moderating the panel this morning. My name is Pollok. I'm the managing editor of International Rental News, which is published by AHL Group. Now, before we introduce the other speakers, I think we're going to conduct a poll. I hope that the poll is showing on your screen. Do you think Europe's construction industry is moving quickly enough on sustainability? So if everybody could quickly, who's watching, quickly answer that question. I'll give the results after I've introduced the panelists. Okay, so we're lucky to have a really fantastic panel this afternoon to focus on the, if you like, the nuts and bolts of construction. We've talked about the policy arena before. Now we're going to speak to four senior people in the supply chain construction. We have Sue Arundale, who's in charge of technical environmental affairs at the European Construction Industry Federation, FIEC, that represents many of the larger contractors in Europe. From the equipment manufacturing side, we have Peter Jordansson, who's Senior Vice President of Purchasing and Supplier Management at Volvo Construction Equipment. We have Douglas McLuckie from Ashtead Group, of course, the owner of Sunbelt Rentals, one of the largest rental companies in the world. He is in charge of environmental, social, and governance at Ashtead. And we have Michel Petitjean, who you just heard talking about the CO2 calculator. Michel is the Secretary General of the European Rental Association. So I can see from the responses, 70% of you do not think that Europe's construction industry is moving quickly enough on sustainability. 30% think that the industry is doing enough. So that's really my first question to the panelists. And I'm going to start with you, Sue. What's your view on Europe's construction industry focus on sustainability? And if it's not doing enough, what's the problem? Sue?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, could I just say that FIEC also represents small contractors, and that although we are known for the largest companies, of course, they use a lot of smaller subcontractors. So we do represent all of the contractors in the European Union. And secondly, well, I suppose I'm not surprised to see this, this result. It's a resounding no. For me, this is not a straightforward answer, but I'm going to explain why. It's partly a question of demand, of course, and contractors build according to the client's request and to the design specifications. I'm not saying that this means we are completely off the hook. In the industry as a whole, and let's include our clients in this, we could be moving faster, but there are some barriers. First of all, we have a lack of availability of secondary materials. Sometimes we have shortages, and we sometimes have problems with quality, and sometimes we are not even allowed to use secondary materials because the buyer does not want us to. Secondly, we have the question of standards and regulations. There are gaps in terms of secondary materials, and as the burden of responsibility is on the contractor, contractors need reassurance about these materials. There are also issues around safety and around fire risk and toxicity. And there are also some policy gaps. So, for example, we have to see how we can fill those policy gaps. So it's not a straightforward answer. We could be going faster, of course, but there are lots of reasons, lots of mitigating factors in this.
Thanks, Sue. But essentially, you would say that the construction sector, your members and the associations that are members of FIEC, they are committed to sustainability. They take it seriously and they're pushing ahead with it.
Yeah, they do take it seriously. And in fact, we have lots of examples because we sometimes see companies' sustainability reports and we see what they're committed to. And the larger contractors in particular, they have very ambitious goals. So they are very committed to the principle of sustainability. As I mentioned, we are dealing with some obstacles. So we need some changes. We need things to go faster. And some of that is related to incentives. Some of that is related to demand. Some of that is related to supply of these materials and quality, but it's also related to regulations. So, but yes, I can tell you absolutely that the industry is committed to sustainability, to circularity, and also to the reduction of carbon.
Thank you. Peter Jordansson from Volvo Construction Equipment, what's your view on this?
First of all, then, Murray, thanks for inviting me to this panel, but I was a little bit disappointed I couldn't vote in the survey there. But I agree with these 70% that say we are not moving fast enough. And I think it's hard to say that anyone is moving quickly enough. But we need to be aware about this is a huge transformation in the whole society. And the construction sector has an important role to play in this. But my answer on that is also that change takes time.
Yeah, I mean, you're speaking for Volvo CE, but you have a very particular approach to sustainability in your business. Looking at the wider industry without naming names, you think some of your peers in the industry could be doing more in terms of sustainability?
I think, yeah, but also we from Volvo, even if we have quite heritage about safety and sustainability within Volvo, I think we can do more, all of us.
Okay, thank you. Douglas, from the equipment rental perspective, is the industry doing enough?
I think it's clear that the attendees, the poll there has came along, Murray, to state no. I think there is a huge challenge between now and the 2040, 2050 scenario within the Paris Climate Agreement there. I think that my personal reason behind it is clients' willingness to pay for better, more advanced technology. So in essence, we are all, we all have a burden on us that we all want products cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And therefore, from the client's perspective, we are forcing industry to make things less expensive, and by that definition, then we're going to start outsourcing and get less desirable products into the marketplace. So for me, looking at some of the blue chip clients, they are absolutely at the top of their game when it comes to sustainability, and they are willing to pay that premium to ensure sustainability and the overall build cost of a project. Some clients just haven't quite grasped that concept yet.
Okay, thank you. Michel, your organization represents the interests of the rental sector. You're focused on sustainability through the CO2 calculator and the circular economy, promoting rental as a core part of the circular economy. Is the rental industry doing enough?
You mentioned the CO2 calculator, but we have developed over the last 3-5 years quite a few other projects. We have developed a project called Sustainable Supplier Framework, which is an attempt to help any stakeholder, and particularly among the suppliers, service suppliers, to evaluate their equipment suppliers, let's say the OEMs, when it comes to sustainability. And we have developed that among all the companies involved, including service companies like rental companies, but also contractors, also OEMs. And it's a good tool to increase the awareness of the relation with their suppliers when it comes to sustainability. We have developed another project which is called CSR KPIs, which means that we have used some consultants going through all our companies and also OEMs and contractors to analyze and list the main parameters influencing CSR policies. So we have developed in 8 chapters a list of parameters indicating some basic, let's say, minimum requirements, some good practice, and for the leading operators, some best practice. So those are tools that we are developing all together, involving not only the rental companies, but also the upstream and downstream. And that's our way of contributing to the improvement of the situation.
Yeah. Michel, those tools, are they a function of demand from your members? The members want these tools, or is it a top-down thing where you're thinking, what can we do to make our industry more sustainable? Is it driven by your members or driven by the association?
It's driven by our members. Actually, the Sustainable Supplier Framework was, we were invited by one of our members to think about it. We submitted it to our committees, and it was approved as a good way of improving the situation. The same thing for CSR KPI. So it's not, it doesn't come from ERA. ERA is nothing less than all our members, is made of our active members operating.
Yeah.
Operators and so on.
Thank you. We'll talk a little more about this CO2 calculator later. Sue, I want to come back to you and ask about, obviously an enormous component of CO2 emissions is generated by the materials that your members are using when they're constructing buildings, and the supply chain and the interaction that the contractors have with the supply chain is obviously an important part of this question. What are the construction contractors doing with their supply chain to try and encourage sustainability?
Yeah, so first of all, again, I refer to the demands of the client and the architect in terms of the choice of materials. However, I mentioned that large contractors do have ambitious goals for sustainability, and indeed, these contractors do have influence, particularly the bigger ones. So they have leverage over their supply chains, and they're able to make an effort on this in this regard. We have some examples. For example, we know of one company that is using its asphalt, 90% of its asphalt is made from previously used building materials. We have another one that insists on having materials only from sustainable sources. So they are doing things. In reality, the smaller contractors have more difficulty in influencing their supply chains. But definitely the desire and the will is there. I should also mention, though, that alongside what contractors do themselves, the regulatory framework is changing. And although there are national differences, so the gains might not be comparable across the member states, we are going through some big changes in terms of regulation. And this is likely to support the contractors because it's likely to make life easier for us and take away some of the obstacles that I was mentioning earlier, like the quality of secondary materials.
Thank you. And what about pricing? I guess it's like electric cars or electric construction equipment. The pricing tends to be higher. If you're talking about sustainable products in construction, are you facing the same issue?
Well, actually, we've heard both. In the main, I've heard that secondary materials are more expensive. So contractors have to take this into account. But we've also heard the other side of the argument where some materials, secondary materials, are cheaper. So I'm hearing a mixed story on this. But I think that going back to what I heard previously, the client has to be willing to go along with the contractor in this fight for sustainability. And that means that clients also have to be prepared to pick up some extra cost in some cases. This applies particularly in the field of energy efficiency, where zero energy buildings are more expensive. So clients need to be aware of that and they need to help us.
And the renovation wave, we were hearing earlier that the amount of renovation work will double over the next decade. That is obviously going to have a big impact on your members' activity. Are they prepared for that? And what impact does that have on sustainability?
Well, the renovation wave, we're very much looking forward to it because we believe that this will stimulate the member states and help them to get the policies right to make renovation wave happen. We will have some challenges, of course, because we need to have a workforce to be able to deliver the renovation wave. And we've had challenges because of COVID, but these will also continue in terms of skills and the availability of the skilled workforce to deliver the renovation wave. So we are gearing up, but we have got some challenges to address in order to be completely ready for this renovation wave.
Thank you. Peter, let's move back to the manufacturing side. I know that Volvo has been progressive in its development of sustainable products. Can you tell us a little about what you're doing, what your strategy is?
I can do that, but first I would like to start and that we talked about sustainability and we are actively working with the sustainability and circularity, of course. For us, it's on the top of the agenda, for sure. And it's also embedded in our purpose, building a better world. So we have set up very strong ambition for ourselves. Then I talk about the Paris Agreement alignment, I talk about the science-based targets and the electrified machines and concepts. And behind me, you can see some of these electrified machines that we launched in November last year. And you can see the compact excavator and you can see the compact wheel loaders. And I'm a little bit surprised that there is quite few of them. We are producing one of these each per day now. Then you can talk about an annual volume of 400 to 500. So I think that we need to step up. But as I said in the beginning there, change take time. But also what I said, that we have a strong heritage within Volvo about sustainability and safety. I don't know if you remember our CEO in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Per G. Gyllenhammar. He said that we are a part of the problem, but also a part of the solution. I think that's also a strong heritage that we have on our agenda. But also to mention what our CEO today said, Martin Lundstedt, when he got interviewed when he started in Volvo in 2015. He got a question then about sustainability. And it was about what does sustainability means to companies? And he said, yesterday it was an advantage. Today it is to be more competitive. Tomorrow is to survive.
Yeah. Peter, to what extent are you responding to customer demand, and to what extent is it self-generated, this strategy? I get the feeling, because you're more progressive than most manufacturers of construction equipment, I get the feeling you're maybe ahead of the curve, even ahead of your customers. Is that true?
As you said then, or I said there, change takes time. And I think we didn't wait for any legislation to do here. I think it was important for us to be in this segment and be the first one on the market. And right now we are beginning to use transition then when it comes to diesel powered drivelines to electrical. We don't develop any more of the combustion engines for these smaller machines. That we have stopped. So now we concentrate on the electric drivelines. But of course, some of our customers are pushing that for new technologies while others are not. But that's about the matureness. And I can say in Europe, it's more mature than in other areas, I would say. So a mix of both.
Okay, we've actually had a very specific question come in about your equipment. When does Volvo see that large electrical excavators becoming available, you know, the big sizes over to the 20 or 30 tons? I mean, you're still going to need combustion engines for those, aren't you?
No, but let's come back to that question, Mara, because I would like to touch a topic also on the machines that you see behind me then. And you asked about customers, if they are forced us to develop here. And I would say that some cities are driving this to be a green city. And I would say, you know, our neighbor here in Sweden, our Norwegian neighbor, and the capital of Norway, Oslo, this is one of these cities that are driving this change. Going back to your question about the big machines then, yeah, I would say that, of course, that needs to be developed now. And fuel cells is for us the way to go here. But it's not developed enough in this big scale yet. And this is why we have started a joint venture with Daimler. And also the collaboration with Shell, because here we talk about the ecosystem that needs to be in place. As we see the electrification journey, it's about both these technologies with batteries and fuel cells, of course. And there are two factors to consider here. Is the hydrogen, if I say the rule of thumb then, it's the hydrogen for the bigger machines and batteries for the smaller machines. And then I talk about certain sectors as agriculture and cities that you can see behind me.
Yeah. So even for the larger machines, hydrogen is going to work? That's what you're saying?
Yeah, I would say that it needs to be hydrogen into the bigger machines, yes.
And over what period? I mean, we're talking 10 years or 5 years?
I would say that somewhere there between.
Yeah, okay.
When we say that we have scaled up.
Yeah, I understand. Let's move to Douglas and Michel in the rental sector. I suppose, Douglas, you're an enormous business. You're investing heavily in equipment every year. It's a challenge for you to switch your fleets from traditional diesel to greener technologies. And I guess you also have to overcome maybe resistance amongst your customers. How are you managing that process?
That's a great question, Murray. I think from our perspective, looking at the switch from traditional combustion engines to electrification, I foresee a perfect storm on the horizon. And the challenge is one that Michel touched on, is electricity supply. And when we look at the exponential growth of electric vehicles for delivery purposes, and then the growth in electrification of rental assets, we need to ensure that the correct supply is available to charge both those types of assets. And if we're not careful, then we're going to run out of capacity on the electricity grid to make sure we can not only charge rental assets, but charge delivery assets as well. Now, when you look at the size of our fleet, we have a huge electrified fleet at this moment in time. It's absolutely huge. And we need to map carefully any new facilities we have with regards to the electricity supply that's coming in. There is a huge challenge there. But you also touched on it, there is life left in diesel. There is no doubt about that. Because although we have lots of blue chip customers, we also satisfy the needs of the smaller individual 1, 2, 3 man size companies that support local infrastructure and local communities, and they're not willing to pay the extra premium for that electrified product. So there is still life in diesel. However, there is solutions coming through, such as new and innovative technologies, such as what Peter has touched on, is hydrogen. Hydrogen absolutely will be a fuel of the future. There is no doubt about that. And not just in the larger machines that Peter has touched on, there will be available in the smaller machines also. So, and from a customer expectation point is they need to be willing to pay an extra premium for sustainability. That will happen. There is a lot of R&D costs at this moment in time being absorbed. Peter will tell you that more than I am at this moment in time. And therefore, that is passed on to us. And if we look at the size of rental penetration, especially here in the UK, 80% rental penetration, we have lots of clout and influence with the OEMs to ensure there is a steady pace of new and innovative technologies coming through the marketplace. And we are pushing that. There is no doubt about it. We are listening to our customers and speaking to the manufacturers.
That's interesting. You talk about the clout that rental companies have as big customers. We're not talking about Volvo here. Are we generally speaking, is the industry, the manufacturers, are they doing enough to develop green products?
Absolutely, there is no doubt about it, Murray. We are seeing, Peter's touched on that there's almost no R&D budget for the smaller internal combustion engines now. That's almost gone. That I can see that across all of the manufacturers we deal with at this moment in time. When we get back to meeting face to face at the rental shows, the last rental show, I did ask the question in Coventry at the rental show there. I asked a number of the suppliers, what is your R&D budget for internal combustion engines? And for the smaller tools, every one of them said the same that Peter has. There is no budget left in it anymore. So that transition for the smaller tools perspective is already happened. I think that happened 3-4 years ago. We are now looking at the 2.5 ton upwards machines now, and how can we change that? But once again, I say that perfect storm that has to be, we need to be cognizant of, it's not just rental assets, it's delivery assets as well. And therefore, we need to make sure there's capacity in the electricity supply to support both those types of assets and charging.
Thank you. In the same way that you have clout with the manufacturers, I guess the contractors have clout with you in terms of driving your behavior. So going back to Sue, to what extent do contractors in Europe view the sustainability or the sustainability credentials of their suppliers, like rental companies, when they're choosing their subcontractors?
Well, they do. Oh, I can hear an echo.
We can hear you okay. I think carry on.
Okay. It depends on the contractor, of course, and in particular the size of the company. And I mentioned earlier that the position of SMEs is different to larger companies. They don't necessarily have the time to check their suppliers. But the larger contractors in particular, and some of the ones that I spoke to before this event, told me that they are indeed checking the green credentials of their suppliers, and it's important, and it has influence in their decision.
Thank you. Michel, we talked earlier about the circular economy and how rental plays into that concept. Is the ERA and is the rental sector making enough of that argument when they're dealing with customers, do you think?
I think so. It's precisely that's when in 2017 we became aware of looking deeply at the position of the rental industry or the rental activity within that circular paradigm, circular economic paradigm. And we went deep in the analysis. We collected a lot of inputs from operators, from different stakeholders. And that's when we discovered that we could identify some parameters, some clear parameters influencing the carbon footprint of equipment. Now, to answer your question, our philosophy at ERA is really to serve our industry at large. And we are open, by the way, not only to rental companies, but also to all kinds of suppliers, mainly OEMs, of course. And our philosophy is to somehow collect the best practice, which comes mostly from the large companies, but there are also small companies providing very innovative processes, innovative situations. So we look at everything we could, we collect those best practice, we put it in shape, as I said before, with those deliverables, and we try to spread them around the industry, because as Sue says before, if the construction industry is very, very much spread in small companies, it's the same for the service companies as well as the distribution companies. So we have a lot of small companies which Rental National Association take care of. So we are very close in working with the national associations, which are, by the way, members of FIEC, to make sure that we can spread those deliverables throughout the whole industry. So that's our way of participating. That's what I call creating value for the industry.
Thank you, Michel. We have some questions coming in, and I'm keen to get some answers on them. So there's a couple of questions here for you, Peter. Can you speak a little about Volvo's approach to dealing with machinery once it reaches the end of its life? What is the circular approach there? And I guess we can ask Douglas that question as well, but let's start with you, Peter.
Yeah, and of course, circularity is so important. I think there is someone that is not muted, so please mute. I would say that circularity is so important, of course, and we are working with that continuously. And when we talk about, we have something that we call reman, and that is the remanufacturing. Then when we are into new technologies, we have set up a new business area within Volvo now quite recently, and that's about VAS, but also energy, Volvo Energy, where we think you can have this circularity in the batteries, as an example now when we go into batteries for electrified machines.
Thank you. Douglas, obviously, A-Plant, you're a Sunbelt, you're an asset manager as one of your roles. What happens to machines at the end of the life? Is it something that concerns you?
It really doesn't concern us, Murray, because the key thing we have within rental is we remarket our products. We only keep them for about 3/4 of their useful economic life. So therefore, so that we can bring new and innovative technologies in at the front end, we exit those technologies after 5, 6, 7, 10 years at the back end, and they go on to have another useful life elsewhere, whether that be in new and emerging countries or whether it be as parts for other products. Then, you know, it really doesn't concern us from a rental perspective, just down to the useful economic life within the rental portfolio.
Got it, thank you. Another question, how do we balance the green and health agendas, removing carbon, but also reducing harmful emissions in terms of noise and also particulate matter and CO2? Who would like to answer that question?
Yeah, I'm quite happy to answer that one, Murray. When we look at the new and emerging technologies that's coming through, we look at the tiers of the engines that we have. We're now on the tier 5s and tier 6 engines and moving forward, aren't we? So therefore, we look at the particulate matter that was emitted 10 years ago compared to where it is just now. It's beyond comparable when we look at the reductions. It is quite amazing, because where innovation, and Peter from a manufacturer will testify to this, where we have focused on reducing carbon, there's been a natural drag downwards towards reducing particulate matter 10s, the NOx and the SOx of this world as well, regards to nitrous and sulfur dioxide emissions. It's just been a natural evolution in the process. And when we look at, and we absolutely map our emissions, as we can see an exponential downward trend in those emissions, which will help society as a whole from a health perspective. You know, if you look at AdBlue, for example, has been a great example of reducing, you know, those types of emissions that we add into diesel engines. We never added in up to even 3 or 4 years ago. So there's been a great downward trend there.
Thanks, Douglas. You know, we're over our time, but I think there's still a few things we can continue to discuss. So let's carry on for a few minutes at least. And I want to talk a little about the CO2 calculator, Michel, and maybe you as well, Douglas. Michel, is there anything surprising come out of the CO2 calculator in terms of how rental companies can adjust the way they do things to help sustainability?
Yes, it's a good question. I already provided some partial answers. Yes, we discovered that there are some parameters very much influencing the total carbon footprint of the equipment. But I would like to come back on why we did a CO2 calculator. It was as a consequence of looking at how could we contribute to improving the carbon footprint situation. And so we took from the start a quite holistic approach, not thinking on ourselves, but thinking on the equipment itself, and going from upstream, from the manufacturers to downstream, to not only the contractors, but the end customers, which owns the buildings, which owns the roads and bridges. So because those are the one to propose reductions of carbon footprint at the end of the day. And it translates to the contractors and then to the service suppliers and then to the OEMs. Because our CO2 calculator today, it makes quite some noise because it's a kind of first of its kind, but it's a rough calculator. I would qualify that a rough calculator because if we have defined after 3 years of working the very solid parameters and elements of what constitute the total carbon footprint of the equipment, we have to go back and now to work hard at complementing and refining. I could just mention some of those in the definition and the production. For example, we have to add the impact of production in different countries, especially for batteries and so on. In lifetime, we are based on operating hours, but we have now to consider idle hours, because idle hours have low consumption, but they may represent up to 40–50% of the total running hours. So we have to add that. In energy, I said it before, but we have to distinguish the type of engine, stage 4, stage 5, and so on. We have to account for hybrid machines and other alternative fuel. It's very complicated matter. We have to enter deep into that. In maintenance, we have been very simplistic so far. We have to add filters, hoses, and someday spare parts, and so on and so on. That's for the scope and content of the calculator itself. Now, the main point is that we did it for the use, the final use, and to help the whole situation, which means that we have a lot of requests now to make it more user-friendly, meaning our stakeholders would like to allow for calculation for multiple pieces of equipment to determine carbon footprint of a whole fleet or a job site in aggregated dashboard, for example, and so on, so on. So we are collecting right now all the feedbacks, and we'll go back and open up probably new projects to go further. Some people consider it too complicated today. It won't be more complicated. It will be more performing and more user-friendly, but it's going to take time.
Thanks, Michel. Just a quick answer, if you don't mind. What kind of feedback have you had from people actually using it? Is there a big take-up, a rapid take-up? Have you been monitoring how many people are using it? And is it mainly rental companies or also contractors?
The surprise is that from the feedback we had, some world-leading manufacturers are using it daily. And I say world-leading manufacturers, and I won't, but I could name 3 of them. And we had them in a committee recently, and they are using it daily. So everybody is involved. And it's like our TCO calculator, our total cost of ownership. When we look at Google Analytics, we have 1/3 of contractors, 1/3 of suppliers, rental companies, and 1/3 of OEMs, which means that we are interesting all the value chain of the equipment.
Thank you. I want to broaden out at the end again, but before we do that, Douglas, I want to ask you about, I know that I was reading the Ashtead ESG report, and I know that you measure obviously your own CO2 output, but you take a different approach when it comes to the actual use of equipment by your customers. And I'm just interested what lies behind that kind of strategy.
That's a great Murray, so when we look at our own Scope 1 and 2 emissions, we have managed and measured those for over 10 years now, and also publicly report under the Carbon Disclosure Project. With regards to our customers' usage of the equipment and the Scope 3, we have now engaged a program to measure our Scope 3 emissions so we can understand the upstream and downstream impacts and report them as part of our strategy. So clearly we touched earlier on, I think it was Philippe that mentioned with regards to science-based targets and understanding how we as a company can support the overall carbon budget and reduce those emissions in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. So we absolutely measure Scope 1 and 2, report publicly on them, and we are now looking at Scope 3 emissions and the use of the equipment itself, as well as the manufacturing and basically the whole life cycle impact of the asset in itself.
So Scope 3, you'll be using the CO2 calculator to help you do that.
The challenge you have is that, as Michel had touched on, the Scope 3 calculator is in its infancy. It still has to be built out with regards to look at whole fleets. There is no doubt about it. It's a fantastic tool in supporting an argument for me that is very crucial. Everyone looks at the total cost of ownership as an economic impact. I think what the calculator does is support there is a carbon budget as well. And a lot of people miss that fact. Once we get the mindsets round, there is a fiscal impact as well as a carbon impact, then we can move towards rental as being supporting more for that drive towards transition in a low carbon economy.
Thank you, that's interesting. Can I ask all the panelists for their view on what the impact of the pandemic will have on sustainability? It's easy to imagine that in a recovery phase that sustainability will be the focus, but economies are weak, cash is low. Can we really expect the pandemic, the post-pandemic world to focus more on sustainability? Realistically, Sue?
Well, things will change, but honestly, I don't think this is a question of the pandemic. It's changing because of the legislative framework. So the Green Deal, the revision of the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive, we're expecting a carbon price for the use phase of buildings, and they're revising the construction products regulation. When you add on top of this, that sustainable finance will be subject to taxonomy criteria. This is a really big deal, really big thing that's happening right now. So this is going to have a massive impact in terms of what is financed, what is subsidized. And so things are going to change dramatically. But as I say, I don't think this is because of the pandemic, they're changing anyway.
Peter?
Yeah, I can add there. I agree with you, but maybe the pandemic was an eye-opener or pushed it a little bit further then. So it started earlier, but of course it had been on the agenda and it will move forward dramatically fast now. I hope and I think, but I think the pandemic was an eye-opener and forced us or pushed us to make it possible earlier.
Thank you, Peter. Michel, you first in response to that, and then Douglas.
I should respond.
Yeah,
Yes,
Michel, on the impact of the pandemic, rental companies have to invest, but it's a difficult time to invest because of the economy.
There are two kinds of answer. First of all, on a generic answer, the equipment rental industry, as everybody knows, is an asset-based business model. It takes very, very, very roughly, and I don't take specialty, but it takes €2 to generate €1 revenue. So it's a very heavy capitalized business. And from what we know now, the rental companies have resisted quite well throughout the crisis so far in trying to keep their assets current and up to work. So they are ready to take up on the work when it comes back, and they will wait as long as it takes, but they are ready and they will be there and to take sales opportunities for a new actions. But the second type of answer is we noticed that the situation of the companies have been very, very different based on the countries, depending on the way the pandemic has been managed by the authorities. So some countries have maintained construction work for the crisis, some have don't. And that has meant quite some difference for the year 2020 at least, and we'll see for 2021. That's basically what it is.
Thank you. Douglas.
I think for me, Murray, is society has changed significantly over the pandemic. And if there's one light at the end of the tunnel that's going to come out of it, is that we all have a different mindset when it comes to sustainability. Peter touched on it. For me, this started 4 or 5 years ago, the push. I think the pandemic has accelerated it. And as we come out, then I think there'll be a huge focus on how we can support, not just locally with regards to the communities, but with regards to our global impact as well. And I don't think that will change. The other point you made with regards to Michel and the rental companies is, and you mentioned, Murray, about a cash conservation. Well, clearly the rental model is absolutely prime position to support that when it comes to that pent up demand to build out as we grow more sustainably. And what better way to do it than support the rental model, conserve your cash and actually support the circular economy and rent.
Thank you, Douglas. That's a nice way to end with a promotion of the rental business and the circular economy. I'm going to hand back to Carole Bachmann of ERA now, but before I do that, I want to thank again our panelists. I think they've done a fantastic job. Sue Arundale of FIEC, Peter Jordansson from Volvo CE, Douglas McLuckie from Ashtead Group, and Michel Petitjean from ERA. Thank you again, and thanks for asking me to moderate the panel. And now I'll hand back to Carole. Carole, over to you.
Thank you, Murray. So now it's time to close the webinar. I want to thank again all our speakers, Murray, Pollok, and all the participants to the webinar. We hope that those discussions have brought different perspectives on the topic of the transition to a circular and low carbon construction sector, but also that they have shown how important it is that all the stakeholders work together to reach the objective of decarbonization of the construction industry. We all have a role to play here. The recording will be available on YouTube in the next days. And well, now it's time to wish you a great day, a sunny day, and I hope that we will be able to meet in person very soon. Take care, stay safe, and bye.